Hi everyone, welcome to week 2 of Strategic Planning and Leadership. As you can see, this week's lecture looks a little bit different than last week. I continue to experiment with ways to produce these videos. So today I'm coming from the Lightboard studio in the Mansfield Library, and we'll see how this works out. So I'm excited about this week. Last week was about getting oriented to the class. This week we dive into the real content, talking about strategy, talking about leadership. What I will try to do with these lectures, I intend to keep them fairly short. I'm really trying to just kind of introduce the theme for the week, maybe point out some things in the readings that I think are important, perhaps pose some questions to you that I'd like you to think about as you do the readings. And so we'll get started. So the theme for this week and the title of our first reading is Strategic Plan. The Strategic Plan is Dead, Long Live Strategy. And so I ask you to read this article from the Stanford Center for Innovation, for Social Innovation. And it's by design that I started the course with this particular article, and the thought that the way that we have been doing strategic planning and the way that many organizations continue to do strategic planning may not be relevant anymore. There may be some things that we need to think about in terms of the pace of change and how that is impacting organizations. This is a graph that you'll encounter a little bit later in this semester in a reading from Thomas Friedman. And this graph was actually created by a guy by the name of Astro Teller, who is the head of Google X. And it's a very simple graph, but I think it does a nice job of kind of showing a picture of the real challenge that organizational leaders face today. So what the story that this graph tells is that really now for about 50 years, the pace of technological change has been advancing at an exponential rate. The ability for humans to adapt does not change at the same rate. And so really where we've found ourselves now is that we are really struggling to keep up with that change, that the technology and the speed of what's going on in the world has outpaced our ability to adapt not only as individuals, but also adapt our organizations. And so this is really the premise of I think how I've tried to build this course as we go along, in wanting you to understand what this real challenge is, the impact it has on organizations. I know what I've seen in the university setting in particular is when we reach this point where things are changing so fast, a lot of leaders just become paralyzed. They know that they don't know how to predict the future. They don't understand how to make organizations adapt faster. And so we'll address those things as we go along in this course. Obviously, there have been a lot of technology innovations in the last 50 years or so that have contributed to this, but none of them were bigger than in the mid-90s when the first graphical web browser was introduced and the World Wide Web really took off. And that was the time that I was actually in the MPA program. I was working in the University of Montana admissions office at the time, and so I was really interested in the web for the potential it had for us to change how we communicated with prospective students. As I got out of the MPA program, started to really appreciate how so much of what we do in organizations in terms of conducting our business and communicating both internally and externally was really going to be revolutionized by the web. And so what I saw was an opportunity that organizations were going to need leaders who both understood the impact of that technology and understood how to transform organizations to adapt to that technology and to adapt to the expectations that clients and customers would have for that. So one of the things that not too long after I finished the MPA program, started looking at kind of where the world was heading with this technology. I came across a book that was titled The Clue Train Manifesto. The End of Business as Usual was the subtitle. I just pulled this partial sentence out of that book. The advent of a global communication system that restores the banter of the bazaar, that tears down power structures and senseless bureaucracies, that puts everyone in touch with everyone, was really what the web was about. Basically, one of the arguments that the book was making was that the typical top-down command and control hierarchical management systems that organizations had relied on for a long time were really becoming dysfunctional and counterproductive in this new world. Communication was being disrupted. No longer was communication being driven through the hierarchy, up and down channels of communication, but really the new technology allowed employees within an organization to communicate very fluidly across silos, across organizational boundaries. Also allowed people on the outside of an organization to communicate directly with people deep inside the organization, bypassing the typical public relations, marketing, external face of those organizations and businesses. So this reading that I assigned for this week talks a little bit about what changed. It talks about how strategic planning really was adopted by businesses and then obviously moved into public and nonprofit sectors, really from the military realm from the 1950s through the 1980s, and in large measure is still used by a lot of organizations today. But really that advent of the World Wide Web in large part, and then kind of subsequent technological revolutionary things, the iPhone, other networking innovations that have been built on, really have made the world a very different place. So when strategic planning came about as a discipline in organizations, the future was pretty predictable. You could rely on the fact that 5-10 years down the road, things weren't going to be all that much different than they are today. At that, data was scarce. It was hard to come by. Organizations typically had to invest a fair amount of resources into gathering that data. Data actually was a strategic resource that organizations might have. And finally, as I mentioned earlier, communication within organizations and from organizations outward were very slow. Typically internally came through those silos of the organization, through the hierarchy. So what has changed in today's world? So obviously the future is not nearly as predictable. Things change so rapidly in terms of new technologies being introduced, new innovations being built on existing technologies, that it's very hard to think even more than 6 months to a year in advance and feel that there's a reliable expectation that those things will remain the same. Data is everywhere. It's cheap. It's easy to acquire. Our competitors typically are going to have at least the same amount of access to that data. So think about how that impacts how we approach strategy. And then finally, communication is significantly different than it was before. If you think internally, within an organization, it's incredibly easy for employees at any level, in any position in the organization, to communicate with someone else in the organization, whether that's basically bypassing the chain of command, bypassing those hierarchical structures. And as I mentioned, it changes the dynamics of the communication between external constituents and internal employees as well. So what the article talks about is this idea of breaking free of the concept of building strategic plans that are expected to last 5 years, 8 years, 10 years, those types of things. And moving from what they termed classic strategy to adaptive strategy. So that means moving from making predictions and then acting upon those predictions to being willing to experiment, ongoing experimentation, seeing what works, prototyping and testing, going back, having constant interaction with the people that you serve to see what works. It means moving from putting a lot of time and resources into data collection to putting much more time and effort into pattern recognition. I know in looking at some of the introductions that you did online, several of you mentioned wanting to explore ways to be more innovative, more creative. This is really where that innovation and creativity happens. Seeing strategic opportunities in all of the noise of all of the data and information that we have available to us. And then the third thing in moving from classic to adaptive strategy is getting past the idea that the execution has to come from the top down, moving towards this understanding that now everyone is involved. So the question I would, or the challenge I would throw out to you is to think about, especially as you're working on your projects, how do you involve people throughout the organization in the development of strategy, in the execution of strategy? There's much more autonomy now among employees when they have so much information at their fingertips and powerful communication tools at their fingertips. Getting that alignment with your strategy looks very different now than it did before this technology was available. So the second reading that we had this week was the introductory chapter to Good Strategy, Bad Strategy by Richard Rummelt. One of my first challenges when I learned that I was going to be teaching this course on strategic planning was to decide what book or books I wanted to use for the class. And there are so many options that it was somewhat of a daunting challenge to evaluate those and figure out what I thought would be the best book. I chose this one. In part, I read it. I don't like everything about it, but I do like a couple of things about it. One, I do like the fact that it really challenges us to think about strategy as a problem-solving exercise. And I think I really like that it also challenges us to think about strategy and execution together. So much of what I've seen in terms of bad strategy is not so much the strategy itself particularly, but the fact that we don't execute on that strategy. We don't actually say we don't do what we say we're going to do. I also like the juxtaposition, the looking at good strategy and bad strategy, and I think it helps for you to be able to recognize strategies and approaches to strategy that are not productive and that are not effective. And so we won't be reading all of this book, but we'll read most of the first and the last sections as we go through the semester. And one of the things that I just kind of mentioning that concept of execution, a little over 2 years ago, then University of Montana President Royce Engstrom asked me if I would design and facilitate a half-day meeting with all of the administrative officers on campus. So that amounted to about 120 people who were cabinet level, deans, directors, chairs. And the meeting was to serve as a kickoff to a strategic planning process. One of the things that came out of that loud and clear, and I think it was a dean who said it was, the University of Montana, and this applies to most organizations, we're really good at coming up with good ideas, but we are really bad at executing on those ideas. And so, that's in my experience, that's a real life example of that marriage of strategy and execution being incredibly important. When you don't execute on what you say you're going to do, it's a dangerous thing in an organization because it starts to create distrust and cynicism and disengagement. And if you've been around the university in the last 2 or 3 years, you've probably seen and experienced a little bit of that. And maybe you've experienced that in organizations that you have been involved in. So I just wanted to share a couple of sentences from Good Strategy, Bad Strategy in the reading that I assigned for this week. So first one, a good strategy does more than urge us forward toward a goal or vision. A good strategy honestly acknowledges the challenges being faced and provides an approach to overcoming them. So that's that, as I mentioned, really looking at strategy as a problem-solving exercise and not ignoring the difficulties that you have to face to implement strategy. And then on the other side of that, bad strategy tends to skip over pesky details such as problems. It ignores the power of choice and focus, trying instead to accommodate a multitude of conflicting demands and interests. So just one last thing I wanted to touch on a little bit before we start this week 2. We will have our one-on-one conferences this week. I will have an opportunity to talk to all of you about the long-term project that spans across the semester, your project to design a strategic process for an organization of your choice. So that project, if you've looked in the syllabus, you see that there are 4 parts to that. The design brief, really, I just wanted you to kind of think in advance about how you would approach creating a process for your organization. Think about what kind of outcomes you want and how you would design the process to get those outcomes. The other 3 bullet points here are the other 3 parts of the project, and they align to basically the 3 parts of a strategic plan. So, strategy is really about understanding where your organization is today, where you want to go, and how you get there. And so the current situation analysis is, you need to think about how you're going to do the homework and understand the situation within your organization, both internally, the resources and the issues, the culture that exists within the organization, as well as what's going on external to the organization that has an impact on that, trends, whether that's social, economic, political, things that you need to take into account so you understand the environment that you're working within. The desired future state, who are you going to involve in identifying what those strategic opportunities are, how ambitious the organization wants to be, what challenges are out there that you want to turn into strategic opportunities. And then the plan of action is really about the execution, the leadership of making sure that those things that you want to do happen, that you're moving forward on a steady forward progress. So that's it for the week. I look forward to our one-on-one conferences. If you do have any questions or concerns outside of our Moodle class or our one-on-one conferences, email me at any time. I'm happy to help out. Good luck this week, and we'll talk to you soon. Thank you.